In the stillness of an evening that could have been any century in the past, imagine a village quietly fading under the dim glow of the setting sun. The story begins not with kings or wars, but with the slow rhythm of ordinary people's lives, the kind of history that rarely makes it into textbooks, yet shaped the fabric of daily existence. Imagine the 17th century in a quiet rural corner of the world, where the air smelled of tilled soil, burning wood, and the distant echo of animals settling for the night. These were not lives of glory or dramatic events, but of small endurance, of waiting seasons out, of planting and harvesting, and of hoping that one year would not be crueler than the last. The roads were little more than paths carved by endless footsteps. Each morning, before the sky turned fully blue, farmers walked slowly toward the fields. They did not hurry. There was no need, for the same tasks awaited them every day. The wooden plows creaked, pulled by oxen with patient eyes, and the soil turned reluctantly under the weight of iron tips. Their world was measured not in hours or minutes, but in the rising and setting of the sun, in the slow passage of winter into spring, and in the repeated circle of labor that never truly ended. Inside homes, built with rough timber and packed earth, women began their day before dawn. The crackle of a fire was the first sound, followed by the heavy smell of smoke filling the single-room cottages. They kneaded coarse bread, sometimes stretching it with roots or ground peas, because flour was precious and often too little. Children stirred awake to the sound of chores rather than laughter. They carried buckets of water from wells, gathered wood, or scattered feed for the chickens. These tasks were learned young, for survival did not wait for childhood to end. The silence of those years was heavy. No great machines cut through the land. No endless carriages filled the streets. Instead, there was the steady rhythm of footsteps, the sigh of the wind, the calls of birds. If you stood there long enough, you might begin to feel how slow everything moved, how patient time was in those centuries. There was no rush, but also no escape from the sameness. For many, their lives were spent within the very village where they were born, with little chance of ever seeing beyond its borders. Illness was a quiet visitor, feared but expected. A fever could sweep through a family, and without doctors nearby, remedies were passed down from generations, herbs boiled into bitter teas, cloth dipped into vinegar and placed on the forehead, whispered prayers spoken beside straw mattresses. Some survived, many did not, and graves were dug quietly on the edge of fields. Yet life moved on because it had to. The living returned to the soil, to the plows, to the spinning wheels, as though grief was only another part of the routine. The evenings stretched long in dim candlelight. Men mended tools. Women spun thread. Children listened to stories passed down from elders. These were not stories of great adventures, but of caution, of why one should respect the river during floods, or why it was dangerous to wander into the forest at dusk. Memory was survival, and survival was the only ambition most people carried. It is easy, from the present, to see this past as dull, but within that dullness was the weight of reality. These people were not heroes, not conquerors, not revolutionaries. They were simply human, trying to keep their families alive, trying to endure the passing years without losing too much. Their history is boring because it lacked drama, but it was also the most universal history of all. If you could close your eyes and sit by the fire in one of those wooden cottages, you would hear the scrape of the pot, the coughing of a child, the sigh of a tired mother. And if you listened closely, you would feel the slow heartbeat of a world where survival was the only story worth telling. The next part of this slow unfolding history does not leap forward in time. Instead, it lingers, stretching across the monotonous rhythm of days that turned into weeks, weeks into months, and months into years. To understand what it meant to live in that world is not to speak of sudden wars or grand decisions, but to follow the dull repetition of work and waiting that defined most human lives. The world of the 17th and 18th centuries in rural America and Europe was carried forward by hands that tilled, by backs that bent, and by voices that rarely rose above the murmur of prayer or the groan of effort. When winter set in, life slowed even further. Fields that once demanded endless toil now lay frozen under a thick crust of ice. Men patched roofs to keep snow from collapsing them. Women preserved what food they could in root cellars, and children huddled close to the hearth where firewood burned slowly, carefully rationed to last until spring. Cold entered through every crack, and despite layers of wool and linen, the chill sank deep into bones. Frost formed on the inside of windows, candles sputtered in the draft, and at night, families pulled closer under rough blankets, listening to the groaning of wood beams as the house resisted the weight of snow above. The boredom of winter was as heavy as its cold. With fields dormant and travel dangerous, people stayed within the same small spaces, doing the same small tasks over and over. Women spun wool for hours, the turning wheel humming like a lullaby. Men whittled wood, repairing handles of tools that would be used again in spring. Children helped with chores but also sat for long stretches, staring into firelight, dreaming of days when warmth would return. Outside, silence blanketed everything, broken only by the caw of crows or the howling of wolves in the distance. Spring did not arrive with joy, but with labor. As the snow melted, the earth became thick with mud. Boots sank into it with every step. Carts stuck in the mire, and the thawing rivers spilled over their banks, flooding fields that needed to be planted. Planting season was urgent, and every able hand was called to work. Seeds were dropped into furrows one by one, covered with soil that clung stubbornly to tired fingers. Hope was planted with each seed, though the people knew that storms, pests, or drought could undo everything. In truth, each year was a gamble, but they played it because they had no choice. Food was the measure of survival. Grain stored poorly could rot, bread could mold, and salted meat sometimes spoiled. Meals were simple: porridge from oats, stews of beans or peas, bread when there was flour enough. On good days, a piece of cheese or meat might accompany it, but such things were luxuries rather than guarantees. Hunger was not a stranger. It visited most winters, gnawing silently at bellies, making people weak and irritable. To sit at a wooden table, eating from rough bowls, was to taste not just food, but the constant reminder of scarcity. Religion filled the emptiness. In small chapels or meeting houses, people gathered each week, their footsteps crunching across dirt roads, to listen to sermons that reminded them of patience, obedience, and endurance. The voices of preachers echoed through the wooden beams, calling the congregation to accept hardship as God's will. The service itself was long, often without music, and children fidgeted while adults nodded solemnly. Yet for many, it was the only event that broke the monotony of days, the only gathering that connected them with neighbors beyond their own families. Illness, once again, moved quietly among them. Infections from simple cuts often turned deadly. Fevers took young and old alike, and childbirth was as dangerous as any battlefield. Death was an ordinary companion. Funerals were brief, with wooden coffins lowered into earth, prayers murmured, and life resuming almost immediately. The land did not pause for grief. The cows still needed milking, the bread still needed kneading, and the plows still needed pushing. For children, childhood was fleeting. By the age of 7 or 8, most were expected to work almost as much as adults. A boy might learn to handle a plow or tend to livestock. A girl would be shown how to spin, weave, cook, and care for younger siblings. Their play was simple: stones, sticks, carved dolls, but it was short-lived, often interrupted by chores. Few ever learned to read, for books were rare and schools scarcer still. A Bible might exist in the household, treasured and carefully kept, but it was often the only book. To read it was a privilege, and to recite verses aloud was both education and devotion. Travel beyond the village was rare and dangerous. Roads were rough, often impassable after rain, and the threat of bandits or wild animals was real. Journeys were measured in days, not hours, and few had reason to leave their familiar surroundings. To most, the horizon was a boundary, not an invitation. Generations lived and died without seeing more than a handful of miles beyond their birthplace. The world outside might as well have been another planet, spoken of in stories, but never experienced. The rhythm of time was marked by bells, roosters, and the slow arc of the sun. Morning began with chores. Midday brought a brief pause for a thin meal, and evening ended with prayer before darkness swallowed the household. Lamps were costly, candles burned quickly, so darkness was respected. People slept early, rising with the dawn because artificial light could not compete with night. The stars above were both familiar and mysterious, twinkling with the same indifference that guided generations before them. And yet, within this dullness, people found ways to endure. There was a quiet dignity in their patience, in the acceptance that life would not change quickly. They told stories, not of adventure, but of ancestors who survived harsh winters, of neighbors who endured misfortune, of small victories like a good harvest or a healthy child. These were the achievements worth celebrating. Not great battles, but simply making it through another season. When viewed from the present, their lives may appear unbearably boring, but boredom was survival. Excitement often meant disaster: fires, floods, invasions, disease. Stability, however repetitive, meant safety. For the farmer who rose at dawn to lead oxen into the fields, for the mother who spun wool until her fingers bled, for the child who carried water from the well. Life was not about seeking entertainment, but about continuing, about holding on quietly to the small threads of existence that tied one year to the next. If you sit long enough in their silence, you begin to feel it: the hum of the spinning wheel, the crackle of fire, the thud of a hoe striking earth. These were the sounds of centuries, repeated endlessly, forgotten by history because they were ordinary. But it was in this ordinariness that most of human history truly lived. The story moves forward, but not in the way of sudden change. Life in those centuries was not a sequence of dramatic turning points, but a long, heavy continuity, each year blurring into the next, each generation repeating the habits of those who came before them. To speak of history here is not to tell of kings or revolutions, but to trace the ordinary, the slow erosion of time on the bodies and minds of people who were born into a cycle of work and duty from which there was little escape. By the time summer came, the village stirred into its busiest season. Heat pressed down on the fields, and the sun burned long hours that left faces browned and hands blistered. From morning until the edge of evening, men and boys swung sickles through tall grass. Women bent low to pull weeds, and children ran back and forth carrying water. The sound of buzzing insects filled the air, the whir of cicadas, constant and unending. Sweat ran into eyes, shirts clung to skin, and backs ached until sleep finally gave them brief rest. Yet there was no complaint, for work was the measure of survival. A field untended was a field lost, and no family could afford such a mistake. Summer also brought gatherings that, though simple, broke the monotony. After long days, neighbors sometimes came together to help each other with large tasks: harvesting hay, repairing fences, or raising barns. These gatherings were quiet affairs compared to festivals of cities, but to the villagers they mattered. Food was shared, rough benches pulled near, and conversations stretched into the night beneath a sky full of stars. Stories were told, not of faraway lands or imagined heroes, but of storms survived, animals lost or recovered, or small triumphs like a harvest greater than expected. These were not tales of excitement, but of endurance. Yet within them was pride. The rhythm of religion remained steady, shaping not only belief, but the calendar itself. Sundays were marked with solemn services that lasted hours, the preacher's voice rising and falling as he spoke of sin, patience, and the eternal reward waiting after suffering on earth. The pews were hard, the air stifling in summer, and the sermons often longer than the children could bear. Yet no one dared to leave early, for absence was noticed, and to be absent too often was to invite suspicion. In a world where community was survival, to be mistrusted was dangerous. Marriage was less about romance than about necessity. Families sought to secure stability, and unions were often arranged or strongly encouraged. A daughter's marriage meant one less mouth to feed at home, and a son's marriage meant new alliances between households. Weddings were small, often no more than a gathering in a church and a shared meal afterward. Yet, for the couple, life after marriage rarely changed from life before. It was still work from dawn until night, still the endless tending of land, still the bearing of children who would grow into the same labor. Love, if it came, was something that grew slowly between shared burdens, not something that flared brightly at the start. Children multiplied quickly in households, but survival was uncertain. Infant mortality was high, and parents often hesitated to name their babies immediately, waiting to see if the child would live. Cradles rocked beside work tables as mothers spun wool or kneaded dough, the cries of infants blending with the creak of wooden wheels or the crackle of hearths. When children survived, they became laborers before they became adults. A girl might be only 10 years old but already responsible for caring for younger siblings. A boy might be expected to handle livestock by the same age. Play existed, but fleetingly. Childhood was short because life demanded otherwise. Summer eventually gave way to autumn, the most critical season of all. The harvest was the culmination of every effort, and its success or failure meant comfort or hunger in the long winter ahead. Whole families worked the fields from dawn to dusk, cutting, binding, stacking, and storing. Grain was threshed, vegetables stored in cellars, and meat salted or smoked. The air was filled with the smell of cut hay, of smoke curling from chimneys, and of sweat mixed with soil. Every sound was purposeful: the clatter of tools, the lowing of cattle, the shouting of men calling across fields. When the barns were finally full, a weary satisfaction settled over the village, though it was never certain if the stores would be enough. The approach of winter once again cast a shadow. Days shortened, winds turned sharp, and families prepared to close themselves in for the long, dark months. Clothes were patched yet again, blankets mended, firewood stacked high. The fear of scarcity never left. Even in good years, the memory of bad winters lingered. People remembered when neighbors starved, when epidemics swept through, when blizzards buried homes so deeply that days passed without anyone leaving the threshold. These memories were not distant. They were living reminders told by grandparents, echoed in the minds of parents, and quietly absorbed by children who knew that such things could happen again. Amid all this repetition, life might seem unbearably dull, but within it were small textures that mattered deeply to those who lived them. The taste of bread fresh from an oven, rare after months of coarse meals, could be a joy. The sight of a calf born healthy in the spring meant hope for milk and meat in the future. The laughter of children, though brief, could warm a room otherwise filled with silence. Even the changing of seasons, though predictable, gave structure to life. These were the markers of time, not events recorded in history books, but the unchanging cycle of ordinary existence. To us, centuries later, these lives can seem like little more than shadows, too simple to remember. Yet, their slow endurance was the foundation upon which later generations built. Without them, the world of inventions, revolutions, and nations could never have risen. Their history may be boring, but it was essential. They were the quiet carriers of time, moving it forward not with brilliance or force, but with patience, with the steady repetition of tasks that, though forgotten, sustained humanity. If you imagine sitting in their silence, in a small wooden cottage, you would hear the faint hum of spinning, the whisper of prayers before bed, the sigh of tired bodies lying down on straw mattresses. You would feel the weight of time not as a rushing current, but as a slow, heavy tide. This was life for the vast majority. Not glorious, not dramatic, but long, weary, and endlessly ordinary. And it was in that ordinariness that the true shape of history lay. The story continues, not with sudden turns or grand revelations, but with the same quiet pace that shaped most lives through the centuries. The people of those rural villages did not measure time by events of kings or revolutions. They measured it by the seasons, by the state of their fields, by the health of their families, and by the steady cycle of repetition that governed everything they did. To live in such a world was to live slowly, almost silently, with little hope of change, but with constant need for endurance. As another year turned, the predictability of life set in once more. Winter pressed itself against the windows of cottages, and the smoke from chimneys rose in straight, pale lines against the gray sky. Families crowded around fires, rationing their food and wood as carefully as possible. The walls of the cottages carried the smell of smoke and damp wool, the air thick with the breath of too many bodies in too small a space. Outside, silence lay heavy, broken only by the occasional bark of a dog or the distant cracking of ice on a frozen stream. The routines of winter were narrow but demanding. Women spun wool and mended clothing, their hands moving constantly in the dim glow of firelight. Men carved tools or repaired carts, planning for spring even though it felt far away. Children were restless, sometimes fighting, sometimes falling into long stretches of quiet boredom. To keep them busy, parents often put them to work with small tasks, winding yarn, feeding livestock, or carrying buckets of snow to melt for water. Days blended together, indistinguishable, except for the Sundays when families trudged through the snow to sit in a wooden chapel, listening to sermons about patience, sin, and the eternal afterlife. Illness struck often in winter. The dampness of cottages, the smoke of fires, and the cold air all worked together to weaken the body. Coughs lingered for months. Fevers rose suddenly, and without medicine, families turned to herbs, prayers, or simply the passage of time. Death was frequent, especially among the very young and the very old. Graves, dug into the frozen earth, became part of the season's rhythm, and each loss was absorbed into the slow continuity of life. The grieving was private, quiet, for survival demanded that the living return immediately to their routines. When spring finally arrived, it did not come gently. Floodwaters from melting snow turned paths into rivers of mud. Animals struggled to find solid ground, and families rushed to prepare the soil for planting. The work was exhausting, relentless, but necessary. Men bent low behind plows, oxen strained against harnesses, and women followed to scatter seeds into furrows. Children walked along the rows, patting soil down with their bare feet, learning from the beginning that survival was work shared by everyone. Hope was planted along with the seeds, but fear lingered, for a storm or pest could ruin everything. The coming of summer marked a return to endless labor, fields filled with the sound of insects and the smell of warm earth. Hands blistered from weeding, backs burned under the sun, and sweat soaked through every layer of cloth. Meals were brief, taken in the fields when there was no time to return home. Work stretched from dawn until dusk, and when the sun finally sank, families returned to cottages too tired to speak. Silence was the language of exhaustion, broken only by the creak of wooden floors and the soft prayers whispered before sleep. Despite the monotony, Small gatherings continued. Neighbors sometimes joined together for barn raisings or harvest preparations, sharing food and stories in the evenings. These were not lively celebrations, but quiet necessities, for no single family could manage every task alone. Trust between neighbors was survival. Suspicion or conflict meant weakness, and weakness could not be afforded. Stories exchanged in these gatherings were rarely of adventure, but of weather patterns, illnesses, and the condition of the soil, matters that determined whether or not another year could be endured. Marriage and family life remained tied to survival as well. Young couples entered into unions that bound households together. A wedding was less an event of joy than a contract of labor, an agreement that two people would share the burden of survival. Children followed quickly, for families needed many hands to manage the endless tasks. Yet each birth was shadowed by uncertainty, for disease could take the child within days or weeks. Parents loved their children, but their love was cautious, tempered by the awareness that life was fragile. Autumn again brought the most critical season. Harvest time consumed every waking hour. Crops had to be cut, dried, stored, and protected before the cold returned. Families worked side by side, their bodies aching, their minds consumed with the fear that their efforts might not be enough. Grain was measured carefully, vegetables buried in root cellars, meat salted and smoked for storage. Even as barns filled, the question remained, would it last through the winter? The memory of hunger was strong, and no amount of preparation ever erased the fear completely. Life in these centuries was not dramatic, but it was heavy. The weight of routine pressed down on every family, every individual. Their days were defined not by choice, but by necessity, not by ambition, but by survival. The boredom of their lives was, in truth, the very condition that kept them alive. To break the rhythm was to risk everything. Fires, storms, plagues. These were the rare excitements of their world, and each one carried devastation. Safety meant monotony, and monotony meant life. If you close your eyes and imagine yourself within that time, you might hear the creak of wooden doors, the clatter of tools against stone, the hum of insects in summer fields, the muffled sound of prayers in winter chapels. You would see faces lined not with age alone, but with the marks of endless repetition, eyes dulled by fatigue, yet sharpened by necessity. And you would feel, above all, the slowness of time, the heavy drag of days that blurred into one another, carrying with them the unchanging reality of survival. Their story is not one of heroes or victories, but it is a story nonetheless, a story of countless people who endured, who bore the silence of centuries so that history itself could move forward. They left behind no monuments, no chronicles, no legends. They left behind only the invisible weight of lives lived quietly, year after year, season after season, in the long, patient continuity of human survival. The passing of time in these villages was like the slow turning of a mill wheel, steady, unhurried, almost unnoticed. Year after year, generation after generation, the cycle repeated. It was not a world of surprise, but of endless familiarity. The history of these people was not made of wars and rulers, but of bread baked, fields plowed, and winters endured. Theirs was a history of patience, of quiet submission to the rhythm of the earth and the sky. The day would begin before the first light reached the horizon. The rooster's crow was not a signal of novelty, but a reminder that another identical day had arrived. Men rose slowly from straw mattresses, pulling on the same coarse garments worn yesterday and the day before. They stepped outside into the damp chill of morning, their breath visible in the air, their boots sinking into the dirt. The tools, resting where they had been left, were taken up again without hesitation. Wooden handles worn smooth by years of use, iron blades dulled and reshaped countless times. In the fields, the work began with silence. Oxen shifted heavily in their harnesses, their hooves pressing deep into the soil as plows cut shallow lines across the earth. The farmer leaned into the task, his body moving with the same rhythm as the land. The sound of iron against dirt, the grunt of animals, the low murmur of commands, all blended into the quiet symphony of labor. Hours stretched without change, broken only by the rising sun or the distant call of a bird. At home, women carried on their own relentless routines. The fire had to be kept alive, its embers carefully fed, for without it there was no warmth and no food. Bread was mixed and kneaded, pots filled with thin stews, clothes washed in basins of cold water drawn from the well. The spinning wheel turned endlessly, the thread winding onto spools, destined to be woven into garments that would be patched again and again. Children clung to their mothers at first, but soon they were pushed into tasks, stirring, fetching, carrying, learning the movements that would one day fill their entire lives. Meals were small and repetitive. Porridge made from oats or barley, bread baked from coarse flour, broth thinned with roots and herbs. On rare days, a piece of meat was added, or a small wedge of cheese. Plates were wooden, spoons carved by hand, cups made from clay or horn. The taste was simple, sometimes bland, but it carried the comfort of survival. To eat was to endure another day, and that was enough. Illness was always near, waiting like an unseen shadow. A cut from a tool could fester. A cough could linger until it claimed a life. A woman giving birth could pass suddenly from fever or blood loss. Remedies were passed down from one generation to the next. Herbs boiled into teas, poultices pressed against wounds, whispered prayers recited over the sick. Sometimes they worked, sometimes they failed, but always they were tried. The people did not expect certainty in health. They expected fragility, and they lived with it as naturally as they lived with the turning of seasons. The calendar was not kept by numbers, but by signs. The first green shoots marked spring, the buzzing of insects announced summer, the cool winds signaled autumn, and the silence of snow heralded winter. Each season brought its own burdens, its own dangers, its own small comforts. Spring meant planting, mud, and hope mixed with fear. Summer meant toil, sweat, and long days that seemed never to end. Autumn meant urgency, the desperate gathering of harvest before frost arrived. Winter meant waiting, enduring, praying that the food would last until the soil could be turned again. Children grew quickly in this environment, not because time was fast, but because their labor was needed. By the age of 6 or 7, they were already carrying water, tending animals, gathering kindling. By 10, they worked nearly as much as adults. Their games were short and simple. Stones tossed into patterns, dolls made of rags, sticks carved into crude toys. Laughter was rare but precious, echoing briefly in the silence before being hushed by chores. Childhood was not a stage of freedom, but a brief training ground for the burdens of adulthood. Religion shaped every thought and action. The sermons were long, heavy with warnings and promises of an afterlife. To the congregation, these words were not entertainment, but instruction, reminders that their suffering had purpose, that endurance was not meaningless. The preacher's voice carried through the wooden beams of the chapel, rising and falling in rhythm with the firelight that flickered against rough walls. Children fidgeted. Adults nodded solemnly, and everyone left with the sense that nothing had changed. And yet everything was held together by the repetition of belief. Community was small, bound by necessity. Neighbors helped each other with large tasks, but they also watched each other carefully. Reputation mattered. To be seen as lazy, dishonest, or unfaithful was to risk isolation, and isolation could mean death. Gossip was another rhythm of life, whispered at wells, shared in fields, carried through families. Everyone knew each other's business, not because they were curious, but because survival required trust or suspicion. The years passed quietly. marked not by events, but by the deepening of lines on faces, the growth of children into adults, the slow fading of elders into silence. A man might live his entire life in the same village, plowing the same fields, attending the same chapel, eating the same meals, until finally he was laid into the ground he had worked all his days. His name might not be remembered beyond his family, his life not recorded in any book, yet his labor fed the next generation. And in that way, he was part of the long, invisible thread of history. To us, looking back, these lives may seem unbearably dull, stripped of drama and adventure, but within that dullness was the true shape of human endurance. It was not excitement that sustained humanity, but the quiet repetition of small acts: planting, baking, spinning, carrying, repairing. These acts, forgotten by history, were the foundation of survival. They were boring, yes, but they were real, and they were everything. If you sit in the silence of that world long enough, you begin to hear its voice, not loud, not insistent, but steady. The scrape of a hoe against soil, the whisper of thread winding onto a spindle, the murmur of prayers said in dim light. These sounds, unremarkable in their time, were the music of survival. And it was through them, repeated endlessly across centuries, that life endured. The silence of the centuries continues, yet the threads of history weave onward. By now, the monotony of daily existence in ancient societies has begun to settle in. People lived not in grand, sweeping stories, but in small repetitions that made up entire lifetimes. The slow pulse of history was felt in every gesture: the plow moving through the soil, the crack of wood being split for fire, the endless folding and mending of garments, the sighs at the end of each day. In many villages across the ancient world, the rhythm of farming dominated everything. Life was dictated not by the desires of individuals, but by the seasons. In spring, there was the slow breaking of hardened ground. Farmers leaned on wooden tools, worn smooth by years of use, guiding oxen or donkeys to turn the soil. The work was painfully slow, and it was repetitive beyond imagination. A single day could mean hours spent walking in straight lines across the same field, back and forth, until muscles throbbed and minds went blank. But still, it had to be done, because without it, there would be no food. When the crops began to sprout, people walked through the fields in careful steps, pulling weeds one by one. There was no rush, only a steady, patient pace. Children were sometimes sent into the fields, small hands tugging at roots, while older relatives supervised, offering little instruction beyond "keep pulling." It was boring work, but it was work that stretched into the very fabric of survival. Meanwhile, inside the village homes, the same patterns repeated for women. Each morning, they lit the fire again, its smoke curling up into the air, filling the home with the scent of burning wood or dried dung. Water had to be carried, sometimes from wells, sometimes from streams far away. The same heavy jars were lifted and carried every day, the same aching arms bearing the load. Once inside, the water was used for cooking, cleaning, and mixing with flour. Grinding grain on stone slabs became another endless rhythm: push, scrape, pull, repeat. The sound of grinding echoed in many homes, steady and unchanging, year after year. Meals were simple and repetitive as well. Most people ate the same foods nearly every day: bread made from barley or wheat, sometimes with lentils, onions, or dried fish. Meat was rare, reserved for special occasions or sacrifices. For the most part, the taste of life was dull, plain, and predictable. But to them it was not about variety. It was about filling the stomach and gaining strength to face yet another day of the same tasks. At night, families gathered together in the dim light of oil lamps or fading embers. Stories were told, but even those stories were often retellings of the same myths, the same ancestors, the same lessons. Children listened half asleep, their minds drifting into dreams that looked almost like their waking lives. Fields, animals, rivers, and work. Sleep itself was another repetition, not an escape, but a pause before everything began again. In these monotonous days, religion became one of the few breaks from routine. People prayed or offered small sacrifices, not with excitement but with habit. A piece of bread set aside for the gods, a drop of oil spilled in honor, a whispered chant spoken without much thought. These rituals were not dramatic. They were quiet, dull even, but they gave a sense of structure. Life was not exciting, but at least it was tied to something beyond the self. Children grew up in this world of repetition, slowly taking on the duties of their parents. A boy who once played with small sticks in the dust grew into a young man pulling the plow. A girl who once followed her mother carrying tiny baskets soon balanced full jars of water on her head. Generations shifted almost invisibly. No one felt like they were living in a story. They were simply alive, carrying on the same roles that had been carried on for centuries. Even in towns and cities, the same rhythm existed. Market days meant stalls filled with goods, clay pots, woven baskets, dried grains, bundles of herbs. But the markets themselves followed predictable patterns. The same people sold, the same people bought, and the same conversations were repeated over and over. Prices shifted slowly, but nothing else changed. A person could stand in the same market square for 30 years and see little difference in the way life unfolded. And beyond it all, the seasons kept rolling. Floods came and went, planting turned to harvesting, autumn drifted into winter. The repetition gave stability, but it also meant that centuries could pass with little variation in the lives of ordinary people. History, in its grand sense, moved slowly and invisibly, while the details of life remained endlessly dull, endlessly necessary. This was the reality of boring history. Not battles or kings, not grand discoveries, but the endless monotony of work, survival, and habit. The silence of their lives did not echo loudly into the future, but it carried humanity forward, one dull, repeating day at a time. Trade, travel, and the slow spread of ideas moved across the ancient world, not like sudden storms, but like a faint breeze that carried on for generations. Villages that once lived in complete isolation began to hear whispers of distant places, stories of markets larger than anything they could imagine, and goods crafted with skills far beyond their own. Yet even this connection to a wider world did not arrive with excitement. It seeped in slowly, almost unnoticeably, and blended into the monotonous rhythm of daily life. At first, trade meant very little more than bartering between neighbors. A farmer who had too much grain might exchange it for a bundle of firewood from another family. A shepherd might give wool in exchange for clay pots. These exchanges were practical, dull transactions carried out without bargaining flair, without the thrill of novelty. They happened as routinely as drawing water from the well or grinding flour. Everyone knew what everyone else produced, and so the trade had no surprises. But beyond the edges of the familiar, there were travelers. Slowly, men from other regions appeared, sometimes on foot, sometimes with donkeys carrying burdens. They brought salt, which was considered valuable, or strange cloth dyed with colors the villagers had rarely seen. These travelers spoke in dialects that sounded odd, yet understandable with effort. When they arrived, villagers gathered not because it was spectacular, but because it broke the dull cycle of their days. Still, even these encounters became a pattern of their own. Traders arriving, villagers staring, goods being exchanged. And then the quiet return to the monotony of work. Markets began to grow in certain towns, and with them came a slightly broader sense of life. Walking into a market square, one could see rows of stalls with baskets of dried fruits, small jars of oil, tools made of bronze or iron, and fabrics of varied quality. But again, after the first glance, it all became part of routine. For those who lived near the markets, it was not a festival of diversity, but simply a chore. Carry grain, sell it, bring home what was needed. Some days, the market was lively, filled with voices, laughter, and disputes. Other days, it was quiet, with the same transactions repeated endlessly, people counting out measures of barley or weighing bundles of wool. Travel itself was slow and boring. A journey to another town might take days on foot, and the path offered little more than dust, heat, and the endless repetition of footsteps. Travelers carried food in simple sacks: bread, dried fruits, maybe a little salted fish. They walked during daylight, rested at night, often sleeping in fields or by the roadside. Sometimes they gathered near a fire, where strangers might share bread and stories. But the stories themselves were usually practical. Reports of floods, of harvests, of taxes collected by officials. Excitement was rare. More often, conversations were filled with the same concerns every person shared: weather, crops, sickness, and the difficulties of survival. The spread of ideas was equally slow. A village might adopt a new tool, but it could take decades for that tool to reach every household. Iron plows, for example, were first used by wealthier farmers or introduced through traders. Villagers who saw them might feel curiosity, but the cost was too high, and so they continued with their wooden tools for many more years. Slowly, eventually, the idea of iron became normal, but it was never a sudden change. It was like watching a tree grow, imperceptible in the moment, but visible over generations. Religion, too, spread this way. A wandering priest or merchant might speak of gods from another land. Villagers listened politely, but rarely abandoned their own rituals. Still, over time these ideas seeped in. A new charm worn around the neck, a new prayer added to the old chants, a small shrine erected at the edge of the field. These things accumulated over centuries, blending the local with the foreign. But to the people living through it, it did not feel like transformation. It was just another small addition to the pattern of life. Even the roads themselves became part of the monotony. At first, they were little more than dirt tracks created by repeated footsteps and cartwheels. Later, some were paved with stone in certain regions, but still, they carried the same slow travelers, the same plodding animals, the same dust rising into the air. Nothing about them was dramatic. Roads connected places, but they did so in silence, in boredom, in the endless repetition of moving feet. For ordinary people, trade did not bring wealth. Most villagers lived with the same simplicity, the same struggles, as their ancestors. A family might acquire a bronze knife or a colorful cloth, but these were rare possessions, carefully stored, often handed down to children. For the most part, daily life remained unchanged. What trade really offered was the faint sense that the world was larger than the horizon they knew. But that knowledge did not make their days more exciting. It only settled into their awareness like another layer of dust. In larger towns, scribes and officials managed records of trade. They wrote on clay tablets or papyrus, marking down how much grain was collected, how many taxes were due, or what goods passed through the markets. For them, life was filled with ink and numbers, not plows and fields. Yet even this was repetitive. Day after day, they wrote the same symbols, counted the same measures, checked the same weights. Their boredom was not in the fields, but in the scrolls. Yet it was boredom all the same. Children in these trading towns grew up watching the rhythm of markets. They learned the weight of coins or measures of grain long before they could read or write. Some helped their parents carry goods, their small bodies bent under loads of baskets. Others learned to shout prices, to call out to customers. For them, markets were not places of wonder, but extensions of home life, another duty to be learned. And so, the story of trade and travel in the ancient world is not a story of sudden riches or spectacular discovery for most. It is the story of slow connections, of dull routines extended across greater distances. Goods traveled, ideas spread, roads stretched farther. But for the people living in those times, it was not dramatic. It was simply life, ordinary and repetitive, as history crept forward one dusty step at a time. Politics, rulers, and governance may sound dramatic when we imagine history through the eyes of kings and queens, but for ordinary people, these systems were rarely exciting. They existed in the background of life, quiet yet unavoidable, like the slow turning of seasons. To most villagers, rulers were distant figures, names spoken with respect or fear, faces never seen, decrees passed down through officials whose voices carried authority. The effects of governance were felt not in grand events, but in small, repetitive burdens: taxes, labor, obedience. The collection of taxes was perhaps the most constant reminder of rulers' power. Each year, sometimes more than once, officials arrived in villages carrying wooden tablets, scrolls, or clay records. They walked with an air of importance, though their tasks were dull, measuring grain, counting animals, writing marks beside names. Farmers who had toiled for months under the sun now saw part of their harvest taken away. There was little room for argument. Grain was measured in baskets, sheep were counted, oil was poured into jars and carried off. The same ritual repeated year after year, leaving behind a sense of inevitability. For villagers, paying taxes was not dramatic rebellion or loyalty. It was survival. They handed over what was demanded, muttered quietly among themselves, and returned to the fields. The act was boring in its regularity. A man might spend 30 years watching his harvest measured by officials, each year giving away a portion, each year sighing, but never truly resisting. The rulers were far away, but their presence was felt in every emptied basket. Beyond taxes, rulers demanded labor. Great projects, roads, walls, temples, canals, were not built by the kings themselves, but by thousands of ordinary people. When the call came, men left their homes and fields to carry stones, dig trenches, or haul wood. The work was long, repetitive, and exhausting, yet it was not glorious to them. They did not see themselves as part of a monument to history. They saw themselves as tired laborers, sweating under the command of overseers. A villager carrying stones for a temple might remember only the blister on his hand, not the grandeur of the finished shrine. Another digging irrigation canals might remember only the mud, the mosquitoes, the endless digging under the hot sun. These tasks were part of governance, but to the people, they were just another layer of monotony, imposed from above. Officials themselves lived repetitive lives too. Their duty was to collect, to record, to enforce. A scribe in the service of a ruler might spend every day writing lists. Lists of taxes, lists of supplies, lists of punishments. The ink stained his fingers. The symbols blurred before his eyes. He was not crafting poetry or grand decrees. He was copying the same words over and over, filling scroll after scroll with the dull weight of governance. For villagers, the presence of rulers often arrived as distant rumors. Someone returning from a city might say, "The king has conquered another land," or "A new law has been declared." But such news rarely changed daily life. The king might have won a battle, but the farmer still had to plow his field the next morning. A new law might be announced, but it only added one more layer of obedience to the countless already in place. History's grand movements passed like clouds overhead, seen, acknowledged, and then forgotten beneath the grind of everyday existence. Even ceremonies meant to honor rulers became routine. Villages sometimes held small gatherings, offering prayers or sacrifices in the name of the king or local governor. But these were not festivals of joy. They were duties carried out with the same tone as paying taxes. A goat might be sacrificed, a prayer spoken aloud. But once the ritual was done, people returned to their work. For them, governance was not something to celebrate. It was something to endure. At times, soldiers passed through villages, reminding people of the ruler's power. They might demand food or lodging, sometimes in the name of protection. To the villagers, these soldiers were not heroes, but burdens. Their presence meant more mouths to feed, more resources consumed. Children might watch the soldiers march with wide eyes, but for adults, it was just another reminder of authority. The monotony of governance was felt across generations. A father who had once carried stones for a temple might watch his son conscripted to dig a canal. A mother who had given part of her harvest for taxes might see her daughter doing the same decades later. Nothing seemed to change. The rulers' names shifted, their statues were built, and their victories carved into stone. But the lives of ordinary people remained tied to the same endless obligations. Sometimes rebellions sparked, but even those were rare and distant. For most people, the idea of resisting rulers was unthinkable. Life was already hard enough without inviting punishment. Better to endure the dull burden of governance than to risk the chaos of disobedience. And so, people bent their heads, paid their taxes, offered their labor, and continued their lives with quiet acceptance. The real story of politics in these ancient times was not the glory of kings, but the boredom of the ruled. Governance did not arrive as excitement. It arrived as routine. Taxes, labor, obedience, repeated endlessly, generation after generation. The rulers may have written their names in history, but it was the silent, monotonous endurance of ordinary people that kept society alive. Family life in the ancient world was not filled with romance, dramatic arguments, or sudden twists of fate. It was, instead, a steady cycle of responsibilities and customs that passed from one generation to the next with very little change. If you asked an ordinary person from those times what their life was like, they would not speak of adventure or excitement. They would talk about parents, marriage, children, work, and the endless duties that tied them together. Marriage was less about love and more about arrangement. Families sought stability, not passion. A boy grew up watching his father work the fields, his mother tend the home, and he knew his life would follow the same pattern. A girl grew up learning household duties, watching her mother fetch water, grind grain, and care for siblings, and she too knew her path was set. When the time came, marriages were arranged by families, sometimes when the children were still young. The discussions were practical. Who had land? Who could offer a dowry? Who belonged to a trustworthy family? Weddings themselves were not grand spectacles for most. A simple gathering, a few rituals, perhaps a small feast if food allowed. The couple might exchange symbolic gifts, a piece of cloth, a ring, or a shared cup of wine or water. But once the ceremony ended, life returned to its steady rhythm. The bride moved into her husband's household, and her work began immediately. There was little space for youthful dreams. Marriage was the beginning of duty. Children arrived soon after. They were not seen as individuals with personal destinies, but as continuations of family labor. Sons would grow to plow fields, tend animals, or learn trades. Daughters would grow to carry water, grind grain, and care for new families of their own. The cycle repeated endlessly. A father taught his son how to hold a plow, just as his father had taught him. A mother taught her daughter how to bake bread and weave cloth, just as her mother had taught her. Knowledge passed not through books or formal schools, but through daily repetition. Family life was filled with small, predictable tasks. A morning might begin with children fetching water, balancing jars carefully on their heads, returning step by step along dusty paths. Mothers prepared meals with the same ingredients day after day: bread, lentils, onions, sometimes milk or fish. Fathers gathered tools for the fields or prepared animals for work. Younger children played in the dust or followed older siblings, imitating their movements until play became practice. Even within homes, monotony reigned. The same walls echoed with the same sounds: the grinding of grain on stone slabs, the crackling of firewood, the voices of family members repeating instructions, scoldings, and small jokes. Meals were eaten together in silence or with simple conversations about the day's work. Nights ended with the same rituals: lamps extinguished, mats spread out, bodies lying close together to share warmth. Families also carried traditions that seemed unchanging. A father might tell stories to his children, but they were often the same stories his father had told him. Myths of gods, lessons of ancestors, warnings about disobedience. These stories were not new. They were repetitions that stitched generations together. A child might hear them so many times that, by adulthood, the words felt like part of their own memory. Marriage customs themselves became repetitive across families and centuries. Dowries were prepared in the same way: livestock, cloth, or tools offered as signs of commitment. Ceremonies followed the same rituals, prayers spoken in the same order, blessings given by elders. Even disagreements within families took predictable shapes: disputes over inheritance, arguments over dowries, tension between in-laws. Nothing was new. Everything was an echo of the past. For women, family life often meant endless cycles of care. They bore children, raised them, cared for husbands, tended to older relatives. Their lives were measured in repetitions: pregnancy, birth, feeding, teaching, repeating. Many women saw multiple children die young from sickness or hunger, yet they continued the cycle, giving birth again, raising those who survived. Grief and resilience became as routine as work. For men, the monotony was equally heavy. They worked the same fields year after year, fought the same battles against weeds, drought, and floods. They shouldered responsibility for feeding the family, paying taxes, and maintaining the household's place in the community. Some men joined communal labor for rulers, hauling stones or digging canals, and then returned home to the same family duties. Generations blurred together. Fathers became grandfathers, sons became fathers, and nothing seemed to change. Old age, too, followed predictable paths. Elders became advisors in families, offering wisdom, settling disputes, blessing marriages. Their stories reminded younger generations of continuity, not of change. They watched their grandchildren play as they once watched their children, and they recognized the same gestures, the same laughter, the same burdens awaiting them. Death, when it came, was marked by familiar rituals: mourners gathering, prayers spoken, offerings made. The cycle closed, only to begin again in the next generation. In this way, family life, marriage, and generational cycles formed the backbone of boring history. These were not the stories of kings and empires, but of ordinary people living in quiet repetition. The details of their lives rarely entered records, but without them, history would not exist. They carried the weight of humanity through time, not with excitement or drama, but with steady endurance. What truly defined their history was not change, but continuity. The same duties, the same customs, the same repetitions stretched across centuries, shaping millions of lives in silence. Family was not a story of surprises. It was the endless rhythm of birth, marriage, work, and death, passed down without end. Death in the ancient world was not a rare or extraordinary event. It was a constant companion, woven into the very fabric of ordinary life. People did not speak of death in dramatic tones, as we might today in stories or films. Instead, they lived with it daily, quietly, almost with resignation. Sickness, accidents, famine, childbirth, all carried the shadow of death. And so when it came, it did not shock people the way it shocks us. It was expected. It was inevitable. Children often died young, before they could even grow into their names. Parents mourned, but they also endured, because death was part of the rhythm of existence. A mother who lost one child might give birth again within a year, and her duties continued without pause. The sadness never disappeared, but it became buried under the weight of survival. A father who buried a son might return to the fields the very next morning, his grief mingling with the endless repetition of plowing, sowing, and harvesting. Death was heavy, but life demanded routine. Burial customs reflected this balance between sorrow and monotony. In small villages, people dug shallow graves outside the living areas. Families gathered to place the body in the ground, sometimes wrapping it in cloth, sometimes laying it with simple offerings: bread, a small jug of water, a piece of pottery. These gestures were not extravagant. They were ordinary, repeated countless times over centuries. There was no question of not burying the dead. It was a duty, performed the same way each time without expectation of glory. In wealthier towns, burials could be more elaborate. Tombs were built from stone, coffins carved, and offerings arranged more carefully. Yet even these rituals followed predictable patterns. Priests recited the same words. Families wept in the same manner. Neighbors offered the same condolences. Death ceremonies became less about individuality and more about continuity, binding the living to traditions as old as memory itself. For many cultures, burial customs included small items meant to help the dead in the afterlife: tools, beads, food, oil. But these were not luxuries for most. A poor family might leave only a crust of bread or a chipped clay pot beside the body. These offerings were not grand gestures. They were tokens of love and habit, symbols that repeated from one grave to the next, one generation to the next. The slow passage of memory worked in similar patterns. A family remembered the dead for a few generations. Children spoke of their parents. Grandchildren repeated those stories. But after that, names faded. In most cases, after 3 or 4 generations, the memory of an individual was gone. Only the rituals remained. Graves crumbled, markers disappeared, and the people who once lived, worked, and loved became silent shadows of history. In larger societies, rulers and elites sometimes tried to defy this forgetting by building monuments, carving names into stone, or commissioning grand tombs. But even those, in time, fell into ruin. Wind eroded inscriptions, floods swallowed structures, and future generations walked past without knowing who had been buried there. The silence of history consumed them all. For the ordinary person, death was not about legacy. Few expected to be remembered beyond their children. Their concern was not how future generations would see them, but whether their family would survive the next harvest, the next flood, the next sickness. Death took them quietly, and their names disappeared like dust swept away by wind. The cycle of birth, marriage, work, and death continued, indifferent to the individuality of those who had passed. The rituals of mourning also became repetitive. Wailing, sometimes performed by relatives, sometimes by hired mourners, echoed the same sounds across centuries. Songs of lament were sung with words so old that no one remembered their origins. Bodies were carried in the same manner, prayers spoken in the same rhythm. For the mourners, grief was real, but the structure of mourning was fixed, as if society itself could not allow death to disrupt the steady rhythm of life. Children learned about death not from stories, but from seeing it directly. A sister might watch her baby brother buried before she could understand the meaning of loss. A boy might help dig a grave for his grandfather, his small hands moving earth while elders whispered prayers. In this way, death became part of education, an accepted fact of existence that no one questioned. The presence of death shaped how people lived. They did not expect long lifespans. Many never saw old age. A person in their 40s was considered elderly in many villages. Wrinkles, gray hair, bent backs, all these were signs not of misfortune, but of survival. To reach old age was to defy the constant presence of death, to endure beyond what most could. Those who lived long often carried not pride, but a quiet acceptance that their time would soon come. Even so, death rarely stopped the monotony of life for long. Fields still needed plowing, meals still needed cooking, children still needed care. A funeral might last a day, sometimes two, but by the third day, work resumed. Villagers could not afford to pause for grief, and so mourning became another ritual absorbed into the cycle of existence. In this way, death, burial, and memory formed the closing notes of boring history. They were not grand tragedies or climactic moments, but steady, repeated realities. Every village buried its dead. Every family mourned and forgot. Every generation vanished, leaving behind only faint traces, broken pottery, worn tools, collapsed houses, nameless bones. The silence of these lives filled the past. They were not remembered in chronicles or carved into monuments, but their steady, monotonous endurance carried humanity forward. Their deaths were not dramatic, but they were countless, and together they formed the quiet ground on which history stands. This was the final rhythm of life in the ancient world. To be born, to marry, to work, to endure, and finally, to die. Nothing more, nothing less. And though their names are gone, their silent lives remain the true foundation of human history. Not in glory, but in repetition. As centuries passed, the quiet, repetitive lives of ordinary people began to leave traces in written records. Writing itself was initially a slow and tedious task. Only a few could do it, scribes, priests, and officials. But what they recorded was rarely the grand drama of ordinary life. Instead, it was lists, ledgers, measurements, and notes of transactions. Yet, within these dull lines lay the footprints of countless people whose daily existence shaped the world. Scribes spent hours, sometimes days, copying the same symbols onto clay tablets, papyrus or parchment. A tablet might record the amount of grain delivered by one village in a given month, the number of cattle owned by a family, or the taxes owed by a household. These were not thrilling stories. They were monotonous repetitions of numbers and names, but each entry captured the life of someone who labored, endured, and survived. A farmer whose barley was counted, a mother whose children were noted, a worker who hauled bricks. Each appeared in some small way on the page. Libraries and archives began to accumulate such records. In palace halls or temple rooms, rows of clay tablets, scrolls, and codices grew, arranged meticulously to preserve the memory of administration. For the ordinary person, these records meant nothing in daily life. A child tending goats would never see them. A mother grinding grain would never touch them. Yet, centuries later, historians would uncover these texts and glimpse the lives of people who had lived and worked in obscurity. Even when scribes recorded events that seemed dramatic, wars, conquests, royal decrees, these accounts were often formal and dry. Kings were named, dates were recorded, outcomes were noted. But the voices of the laborers, the villagers, and the women who lived through these times were silent. The battles raged somewhere in the distance. For most, life remained the same: planting, tending animals, weaving cloth, and enduring disease. History, as written, captured the events, but it was built upon the monotonous continuity of countless invisible lives. With the invention of more portable materials like papyrus sheets and later parchment, writing slowly became more common, but still limited. Town officials recorded births, deaths, and marriages in registers that were plain, unimaginative, and repetitive. A line might read, X born to Y and Z on the 5th day of the month, buried on the 12th day. Each line seemed dull, a mere statement of fact, yet each entry was a life lived, a story in miniature. Future generations could trace family lines, demographic patterns and social structures, all through the dull repetition of names and dates. Books eventually emerged as collections of such records, sometimes interwoven with chronicles or religious texts. The lives of ordinary people remained in the background, often invisible except as laborers, farmers, or subjects of taxation. The chronicler might note that a village contributed a certain number of soldiers or supplied grain for the army, but rarely would they describe the daily toil, the repeated plowing of fields, the quiet endurance of entire households. Yet all of history, the victories, the defeats, the rise and fall of kings, depended upon these invisible, monotonous lives. Nobles and elites often wrote letters, memoirs, and decrees capturing their personal experiences. These documents were more expressive, more interesting in the conventional sense. But they could not exist without the background of ordinary life. The soldier needed to be fed, the palace needed grain, the streets needed laborers. Even a king's grand story required the humdrum, repetitive work of countless unknown people. Without them, there would be nothing to record. Over time, record-keeping became more structured. Census-like documents appeared, inventory lists of temples and towns grew, and accountants or clerks multiplied. Their work was almost comically repetitive. Count jars, measure grain, tally laborers, note arrivals and departures. Yet in the accumulation of these records, a pattern emerged. The history of ordinary life slowly became visible. Scholars in later centuries could reconstruct seasons, harvests, population trends, and the invisible skeleton of human survival. Even literature, when it touched upon ordinary life, often romanticized or exaggerated events. But if one looks closely, the core of human experience remained monotonous and repetitive. Children learning skills, families laboring together, women grinding grain, men hauling wood, people enduring sickness, famine, and death. These details, mundane and boring, were the substrate on which all narratives rested. Without these routines, without these dull cycles, nothing else could exist. Records also preserved the invisible work of women. Though rarely named, women appeared in census records, tax lists, and household inventories. Their labor, spinning, weaving, baking, nursing, was essential, even if never celebrated. Each spool of thread, each loaf of bread, each cup of water carried to a family was a contribution silently noted by history in its most administrative form. Later historians might read the records and imagine lives, reconstruct routines, and see that these acts, mundane as they were, formed the backbone of society. Similarly, tradespeople, craftsmen, and laborers appeared in accounts of transactions, not as protagonists but as functional parts of the economy. A blacksmith's output, a potter's wares, a carpenter's planks, listed plainly with quantities and dates, revealed the rhythm of everyday work. These details, boring to contemporaries, became invaluable for understanding life centuries later. They documented the continuity of labor, the predictability of life, and the quiet endurance that allowed civilization to persist. Even religious institutions contributed to this documentation. Temples recorded offerings, priests noted festivals, and ritual calendars were maintained with astonishing regularity. These documents provide modern readers with glimpses into daily life: who gave offerings, who attended festivals, how resources were allocated. Again, the excitement is minimal, but the underlying picture is one of remarkable consistency. Lives repeated themselves so faithfully that scribes could record them without imagination. Yet those records became treasures for historians seeking to understand boring human existence. And so, written history, the archives, the records, the ledgers, the books became the mirror of dull continuity. They may appear tedious, full of lists and repetitive entries, but within them lies the essence of human life. The endless plowing, weaving, cooking, caring, and enduring of ordinary people is what allowed empires to stand, civilizations to grow, and history to be written at all. Even as historians and readers look back, they often search for dramatic events, battles, revolts, discoveries, speeches. Yet, beneath those events lies the real story, the quiet, monotonous lives of people who lived, worked, and died without fanfare. Every scroll, tablet, or book is built upon this foundation. Without it, the stories of kings, heroes, and conquerors could not have existed. The so-called boring history is, in fact, the invisible architecture of the human past. Centuries later, scholars reconstruct the mundane rhythms of daily life from these seemingly dull records. They trace family lines, estimate population trends, examine crop yields, and understand patterns of work and survival. The apparent tedium of these records is precisely what allows such reconstruction. The repetition, the predictability, the monotony, all are essential. Without consistent detail, the continuity of life would be lost to time. And so, boring history, once invisible, became written history. It is in the tallies, ledgers, and lists that we find the endurance, labor, and routine that shaped civilization. Every record of grain, every census, every minor ritual entry reminds us that history is not made solely by events or extraordinary people. It is made by ordinary lives, repeated endlessly, quietly, without recognition, forming the silent foundation upon which the world stands. As we reach the final stretch of this long, monotonous journey through time, it becomes clear that the story of humanity is less about spectacle and more about persistence. Scene after scene, century after century, ordinary people lived lives defined by repetition, endurance, and subtle continuity. By the time we reach the point of reflection, there is no sudden climax, no dramatic revelation. Only the quiet accumulation of countless ordinary acts that together form the backbone of civilization. The villages, towns, and early cities of history were shaped not by kings or generals alone, but by the ceaseless labor of countless men, women, and children. Their lives were structured by the immutable rhythm of work, seasons, and survival. Fields had to be plowed, seeds sown, animals fed, and grain stored, each task repeated endlessly, each day echoing the one before, and each year blending into the next. While rulers recorded victories and priests noted rituals, it was this dull continuity that sustained society. Families remained the central unit, repeating the cycles of birth, labor, and death. Sons and daughters learned the same skills their parents had mastered. Fathers and mothers worked from dawn to dusk, passing knowledge down to children, who then continued the cycle. Marriage arrangements followed customary patterns, chores repeated daily, meals mirrored yesterday's meals, and children were trained to endure the same hardships their parents had known. Even love and grief existed in measured, predictable ways. The deaths of loved ones were mourned, rituals performed, and life resumed. Each generation became a mirror of the previous one, their routines linking the past to the future. Even as communities grew and connected through trade, roads, and communication, the underlying monotony persisted. Markets brought goods from distant lands. Travelers introduced new ideas, and minor technological innovations arrived slowly. But, for the majority, daily life remained painfully predictable. Fields still needed tending, homes still required maintenance, fires had to be kept burning, and children needed care. Change arrived not as a sudden shock, but as a gradual layering upon a foundation of unchanging routines. Governance, too, imposed its predictable weight. Taxes were collected in the same ways, labor was demanded for public works, and decrees reached villages with dull regularity. For the ordinary person, A new law or ruler meant little more than another set of instructions to follow, another small adjustment in an already full schedule of repetitive duties. Even wars, battles, and conquests, the events that dominate history books, were peripheral to the lived experience of most people. They continued their labor, endured hardships, and adapted quietly, with minimal disruption to their daily monotony. The written word eventually preserved these cycles. Scribes recorded births, deaths, marriages, taxes, and offerings. Ledgers, census lists, and administrative documents captured the humdrum details of life, providing modern historians with glimpses into the enduring routines of ordinary people. Libraries and archives became silent monuments to continuity, meticulously preserving the dull repetition that allowed societies to function. These records are often perceived as boring, but within them lies the invisible scaffold of civilization. Without this foundation of ordinary lives, kings, armies, and empires would have been hollow, unsustainable. As centuries turned into millennia, life continued to be shaped by the same basic needs: food, shelter, family, survival. Disease, famine, and death remained ever-present companions. Communities endured the seasons and the cycles of life and death. Even as technologies improved and societies became more complex, the rhythm of daily existence, work, care, repetition, remained remarkably constant for ordinary people. Yet, from this continuity arose resilience. Ordinary people who bore the weight of boredom, repetition, and toil were the true architects of society. Without their labor, knowledge, and endurance, nothing else could exist. The achievements of rulers, the spread of empires, the construction of monuments, all depended on the mundane, unglamorous acts of countless individuals whose names would never be remembered. History is not merely a tale of the spectacular, but of the consistent, patient persistence of the ordinary. When reflecting on this, one realizes that the so-called boring aspects of history are the most important. The planting of crops, the tending of livestock, the weaving of cloth, the drawing of water, the carrying of burdens, the observance of rituals, the repetition of generations, these form the invisible spine of civilization. The lives of ordinary people, repeated countless times, are the substance upon which all historical narrative is built. Even death, once a constant shadow, contributed to this enduring structure. Burial rituals, mourning customs, and the slow passage of memory tied generations together. Individuals vanished, yet their patterns, their routines, and their labors persisted. They left traces, often faint and administrative, that allowed future generations to reconstruct the past. Their stories may not be exciting, but they are essential, forming the substrate upon which recorded history rests. As history moved forward, the world became more connected, societies more complex, and records more detailed. But the fundamental elements of life remained the same: repetition, labor, endurance, family, survival. Every era, every civilization, every community rested upon the silent, monotonous actions of ordinary people. Their persistence is what allowed culture, technology, and governance to endure. It is the boring, repetitive acts that create the scaffolding for what is remembered, celebrated, or written down. In the end, boring history is not truly boring. It is profound. It teaches patience, endurance, and the invisible power of continuity. It reminds us that human progress does not occur solely in dramatic leaps, but in the cumulative repetition of countless mundane acts. Every loaf of bread baked, every field plowed, every child raised, every stone hauled. These are the true foundations of history. Thus, our journey through the monotony of centuries concludes. There are no fireworks, no climactic battles, no sudden revelations. There is only the enduring, unremarkable, and persistent rhythm of human life. This rhythm, the plodding of daily existence, the repetition of work and duty, the cycle of generations, and the quiet passage of death, is what carried humanity forward. It is the invisible force beneath every chronicle, every monument, and every story ever told. History, at its core, is built not from moments of excitement, but from the patient, relentless endurance of ordinary lives. Without these lives, all else would collapse. They are the silent majority whose monotonous existence created the world we inherit today. And in this quiet, uncelebrated way, boring history becomes the true story of humanity. Steady, persistent, and everlasting.